Today we continue our discussion of the evolution of the Spanish language from Latin. In this video, we'll discuss the emergence of the Old Spanish palatal consonants. This discussion follows closely Section 2.5 of the book A History of the Spanish Language by Ralph Penny. The Latin consonants. Up to about the 1st century A.D., the spoken Latin language used these 13 consonant phonemes. Linguists categorize these consonants into orders and series. So Latin had 3 orders of consonants and 6 series. Now these are hardly the only consonant sounds the human mouth can produce, and people with a background in phonetics will notice that whole categories of consonants found in other languages are missing from Latin. As Latin evolved into Old Spanish, all but one of the original Latin consonants were preserved. H was lost very early on, and a whole new order of palatal consonants came into being. Additionally, a series of voiced fricatives arose, paralleling the Latin voiceless fricatives, but that will be a topic for a later video. In this video, we're going to focus on the phonological processes that gave rise to the palatal consonants of Old Spanish. Word initial I. Literary Latin had only 3 diphthongs, and none of them started with I, so combinations of I plus another vowel were considered hiatuses. But in spoken Latin, these combinations came to be articulated as diphthongs, and the I was articulated as the glide y. So ia, ie, io, and iu became ya, ye, yo, and you. This change from hiatus to diphthong was dependent on where in the word the vowel combination occurred, and it happened earliest in word initial position. So in early spoken Latin, this word was probably pronounced something like Januario, where this vowel combination was a diphthong, and these two were hiatuses. Later on, word initial y became the palatal fricative consonant y, or sometimes the affricate j. So Januario would have become something like Januario. This change in word initial I is reflected in contemporary misspellings like these. Of course, none of these spellings can be taken as exact transcriptions, but they're an obvious sign that the vowel sound E had morphed into a fricative. Palatalization of consonant plus y. In the transition from spoken Latin to Old Spanish, when a consonant appeared before the y sound, the y often acted on the consonant, converting it into a palatal. Let's look at some examples. Tia and kia. By the 1st century A.D., palatalization of these combinations had produced these outcomes. So this word would have been pronounced something like potio in spoken Latin, and in the transition to Old Spanish would have become pozzo. And this word would have been pronounced martio in spoken Latin, and become marzo in Old Spanish. Similarly, this word would have been something like ericio, and become ericho. And this word would have been calcia, and become calcia. And again, contemporary misspellings of Latin words attest to these sound changes. Now most Romance languages maintained the contrast between these two results, but in pre-literary Castilian, they merged into ts. When preceded by a consonant, this ts pronunciation survived into Old Spanish. However, when preceded by a vowel, ts often underwent a process of softening and voicing called lenition, usually producing z in Old Spanish. So first ericho and calcha became erizo and calza. Then pozzo and erizo became pozzo and erizo. Geminate t and k were also palatalized when followed by y, producing in spoken Latin the geminate ts. And in pre-literary Castilian, these 3 combinations also simplified to geminate ts. Later simplification merged all these into simple ts in Old Spanish. So matiana became mazzana, and then mazzana. And braccio became brazzo, and then brazzo. captiare, reduced to cazzar, and then cazzar, and derectiare, reduced to derezzar, and then derezzar. And in this example, asciola, reduced to azzola, and then azzuela. Lia. The lia combination became the voiced palatal lateral lie in spoken Latin, what I call elie, a sound which persisted in most areas. However, in pre-literary Castilian, this elie was modified to j. This transformation may have been a way to maintain a contrast between the phoneme originating with lia and the phoneme originating with double L, since double L was transforming into elie in Old Castilian. Here are some examples of lia to j. Alio became alio and then ajo. Folia became folia and then foja. Moliare became moliar, and then moliar, and then eventually mojar. Muliere became mulier, and then mujer. Meliore became melior, and then mejor. Nia. In spoken Latin, the nia combination underwent what's called mutual assimilation, becoming in essence one sound, the voiced palatal nasal ñ. English speakers sometimes have a hard time distinguishing between ñ and ñ, but it's an important distinction, not only in Spanish, but Portuguese, Italian, and other Romance languages. If you don't know what the difference is, I have a whole video on this subject that I recommend you watch. I'll put a link in the description. In Old Spanish, ñ was spelled double N and later contracted to this character. Observe these examples. Araña became araña. España became España. Señore became señor. And viña became viña. Dia and gia. In spoken Latin, dia and gia were palatalized and merged into the geminate j. In Western Romance, this geminate j then reduced to simple j. So, podio became pollo. Radiare became radiar. Exagio became esagio. And fagia became fagia. Now this was not the only outcome of dia and gia. Where j was preceded in early Old Spanish by a front vowel, the consonant was lost. And where Latin dia was preceded by a consonant, the result of the palatalization was ts. Feel free to pause the video and examine these examples. Palatalization of syllable initial velars. In spoken Latin, when k and g were followed by any of the front vowels, they became palatalized and contributed to the emergence of the Old Spanish phonemes ts, z, and j. So que in this word generated the same consonant as kie in this word, with paque becoming patse and facie becoming fatse. Later, when the ts of spoken Latin occurred between vowels, regardless of the source it derived from, it underwent lenition or softening in all Western Romance dialects. In Old Spanish, ts became the voiced phoneme z. So, dice became didze, and fazer became fadzer. Racimo became radzimo, and vecino became vedzino. Spoken Latin g, when followed by a front vowel, became the voiced palatal fricative j. So the first sound in these two words was the same. And this fact is attested in the usual misspellings by Roman citizens. Sometimes this j sound was preserved in Old Spanish in word initial position, especially when the first syllable in the word was stressed, like in these examples: yema, yeso, and yadze. However, because the diphthong ye was the product of open e in a stressed syllable, see my videos on the evolution of Spanish tonic vowels, when ye produced by some other phonological process was in an unstressed word initial syllable, people had the sense that it didn't belong and should be a simple e. For this reason, the unstressed ye of words like germano and genero would have felt out of place and become just e, hermano and enero. Same with gelar and gencias, which became elar and encias. Feel free to pause the video and study these examples more closely. Palatalization of syllable final velars. In Old Spanish, the sounds k and g underwent changes when they were followed by another consonant within the same word. Initially, they underwent fricativization, and then they underwent vocalization, generating something of an off-glide, e. These changes had two major effects. 1. Our old friend metaphony. The glide had the effect of raising the preceding vowel a step, the e often then merging with that vowel. 2. The following consonant was affected, creating new palatal phonemes. Now this is all pretty complicated, and I'll confess I'm not sure about all the intermediate steps, but here are some examples of spoken Latin to Old Spanish before and after. Dixi became dice, mataxa became matesha, entaxo became tesho. Facto became fecho, nocte became noche, enstrecto became estrecho, molto became mucho, and coltello became cuchillo. Lentecla became lenteja. Novacla became navaja. Oclo became ojo. And vermeclo became bermejo. Regla became reja. And tegla became teja. In spoken Latin, in the sequence t, unstressed vowel t became k. Examples of this are attested in the appendix probi. Naturally, this consonant group shared the same evolutionary path as k. So, roclare became rojar, and veclo became biejo. Additionally, the gn combination merged with the ny combination, becoming enye. So, legna became leña. Pugno became puño, and stagno became estaño. Now these transformations only occurred when the following letter was a vowel. When the following letter was a consonant, or when the group came at the end of a word, the syllable structure was completely different, so the outcome was different. Because these combinations didn't produce new Old Spanish palatal consonants, I'm not going to go into them in detail here. Feel free to pause the video and examine these examples. Palatalization of double L and double N. Like many consonant sounds, the Latin geminates double L and double N underwent lenition in the transition to Old Spanish. Double L produced an entirely new Spanish phoneme, LAKEY, and double N merged with the product of ny and gn, becoming enye. So, cavallo became cavallo, gallo became gallo, and valles became valles. Anno became año, canna became caña, and grugnire became grugnir. Palatalization of pl, cl, and full. Something really interesting happened with word initial pl, cl, and full in Old Spanish. First, it seems that the L in these groups palatalized to LAKEY early on in the spoken Latin of parts of Iberia. Later, in pre-literary Castilian, in most cases the initial consonant was absorbed by the LAKEY. So, plaga became llaga, plano became llano, and plecare became llegar. Clamare became llamar, glosa became liosa, and clave became llave. Also, flamma became llama. Now this transformation wasn't universal. There are some common words in which these consonant groups remained unchanged. And when pl, cl, and full appeared in the middle of a word following a consonant, it was normal for them to transform to ch. So amplo became ancho, and emplere became enchir. Mancla became mancha, and inflare became hinchar. In a few cases, pl at the beginning of a word became ch, probably by analogy with the previous transformation. So, Plato became chato, and plopo became chopo. All right, this has been our discussion of the evolution of the Spanish palatal consonants. In our next video, we'll continue discussing the evolution of the Spanish consonants.